Welcome to our class on Chassidus. We're going to be learning a beautiful Chassidic discourse from the Rebbe. The name of the Chassidic discourse is called Taq'u בחודש שופר. The Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse on the second day of Rosh Hashanah in the year tafshin mem zayin, which is approximately 38 or now going to be 39 years ago. And the Rebbe went on to release the Chassidic discourse in honor of the 6th day of the month of Tishri in the same year tafshin mem zayin. So the Chassidic discourse is based on a verse in Psalm 81, verse 4, where it says, Taq'u בחודש שופר, should blow בחודש, in the month, shofar the shofar, by Kesser, when it's covered over, liyom chagein, to the day of the holiday. And again, in this verse is obviously discussed at length in Chassidic discourses. So the Rebbe says that the previous Rebbe explains with a Chassidic discourse titled Taq'u in the year Tafshin Zayin, so it would be 40 years from when the Rebbe said the Chassidic discourse. And we know the rule is that after 40 years, when you have full clarity and comprehension of what you were taught 40 years before. So Chazal tells from the verse, what is the month that Chodesh is covered up? So that is referring to Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because Rosh Hashanah is when the moon is totally covered up. And so that's one idea. And also by Kesser, what does Kesser covered up mean? So Kesser is actually spelt with 3 letters, a Chaf, a Samach, and a Hey. So it's basically broken up to two words, case for covering, and Hey, number 5. What is 5? So 5 we know is referring to the sphere of Malchus. Like, you know, even in Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the last Hey is spheres of Malchus. So Kes is covered up and Malchus. And what does that mean? That it's covered up, and Rosh Hashanah is called Kesser. Why? Because in Rosh Hashanah, spheres of Malchus, a sphere of Malchus gets covered up and it gets concealed into the concealment. Is like it's called in Kabbalah, Helam Atzmi, the ultimate concealment. And it never says possibly you can add the connection between the idea that the holiday of Chodesh, that it gets covered literally, because what does it mean literally? Like we already explained before, that Chodesh is referring to the month, which is connected to the moon, and we know that the moon is the smallest, and the moon is what connected to the idea of spheres of Malchus. So Rosh Hashanah is Malchus, the moon is Malchus, etc. Now, what is the main work of Rosh Hashanah? Is to build Malchus. Like it says, Imril Fani, tell me Malchios, the verses of kingdom, so that I can be king over you. So we're trying to build Malchus from Rosh Hashanah. And in order to draw down Malchus, how do you do that? Through blowing the shofar, Tkiya shofar. And that's why it says, Taq'u b'chodeh shofar, blow in the Rosh Hashanah the shofar, Bakesa, to bring down Keseh, which we said is the idea of what? Of the concealment of Malchus, and Malchus will get revealed. Now, as we know, the point that our teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, in his classical works, Keseh Shem Tov brings out on this verse, and he asks a simple question. It should have read, it reads, Taq'u b'chodeh shofar, but really, what are you blowing? You're not blowing the chodesh, you're blowing the shofar. So you're blowing the shofar on Chodesh. So seemingly the verse should have said, Taq'u shofar b'chodesh, blow the shofar on the beginning of the month. And what does the Baal Shem Tov explain? Because a person has to realize, in a consistent way, that everything you do, b'chodesh. You know, it says chodesh first. What does it mean, chodesh? Chodesh means month, but also chodesh means new. That means we have to always create newness in all our actions. That means we shouldn't go into a routine mode. You know, why are we praying? Why are we studying? And why are we doing mitzvah? Because we did it yesterday. That's what we're supposed to do. But no, b'chodesh, you need newness. You need to be constantly excited as if it's a brand new idea. And what does that mean? The Rebbe says he'd like to explain. Because since this idea of Taq'u b'chodeh shofar is not just a specific idea, but it's a main idea of Judaism. It's a general idea of Judaism. As we know, Rosh Hashanah is all about making Hashem king over us. So therefore, there's a very, very powerful lesson, an important lesson, a global lesson in our general service of Hashem, of every single Jew, that how should we serve Hashem? It has to be done in one key word, in a way of chodesh, in a way of chiddush. It should be new. What does that mean? Every single time that you're doing something, even though you did it 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, as many times you do it, you should do it as if the first time you're doing it, with the newness and the excitement of the new time. And that is obviously based on the Baal Shem Tov. And there is possibly you can add And that's why he says tiku'u, to blow. What is the idea of tiku'u? So tiku'u means to blow, but tiku'u also comes from the expression of strong and established. In other words, a person should set himself up in a strong way, in a solid way, that there should not be any change in your serving Hashem from the first time. In other words, you establish yourself taqua, you put yourself in an everlasting way, and what happens then is that just like the first time there was excitement, the same thing also, every single time you continue with that excitement. And with this you can explain what it says before that in the teaching of Baal Shem Tov. In other words, what's the idea of a miracle? A miracle means it happened the first time. What happens the second time? The same miracle happens twice, now you're calling it nature. But the fact is, if a miracle happened once, it's a miracle. If it happens the same miracle again, we're calling it nature. But the truth is, the second time is also a miracle. But why are we calling it nature? Because it happened already once before. But the point Rabbi is explaining is, no, we have to realize that the second time is also a miracle. And that's the same thing also when we're serving Hashem. We do it the first time with passion and excitement, and we need to do it the second time as well, and the third, etc. And he'd like to connect this with the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that everything in the world gets created and recreated every second. Now, so why is it called nature? Because it was created once before, and it's not the first time it's happening. But when a person meditates, and the fact that everything is really a miracle, and everything is really new, that gives us the power that in everything that we're doing, we should do it in a renewed manner. So this is obviously, before we go further, I just want to recap this major point, that life is supposed to be a davar chadash, always. Even though we did it, and we're going to do it again. No. Every time we're doing it, it's brand new. And why? Because the fact that Hashem is recreating the world right now. Okay, and he continues on in the Chassidic discourse of the previous Rebbe in the year of tshmn, which was 40 years before the Rebbe said the Chassidic discourse, and he explains what does kesem mean. It also comes from the expression of a time, zman, which is time, and a set time. In other words, there's a set time and a finite time to bring down Malchus. What does that mean? He explains as follows. He'd like to explain the connection between, we just learned the new idea of what does kesem mean. First we learned kesem means it's concealed, but now he's saying kesem, it's a time, to the idea of Rosh Hashanah, based on a teaching of the Maggid, the famous teaching of the Maggid, which is brought down in the Chassidic discourses of the Alter Rebbe, which is actually printed in the Siddur with the Chassidic teachings, which is written through his son, the Alter Rebbe's son, and the one that took over leadership afterwards, the Mittler Rebbe, that time is a creation. And therefore, what do we see from here? Just like on Rosh Hashanah, what happened in Rosh Hashanah? There's a newness in the whole creation of the world. Like it says clearly, Zeh HaYoim, this day referring to Rosh Hashanah, Tchilas Ma'asecha, it's the beginning of your actions, and Zikaron, it's a remembrance of the first day of creation. So the same thing also, on Rosh Hashanah, it's something which is totally new, not only Hashem's trying to create the world, but also in the whole DNA of time and space and everything that existed, everything that exists, because the fact is we know time and space, that is world. And there's a newness in time and space as well. And what does that mean? They're explaining as follows. We know the point that's brought out, the Alter Rebbe brings it out in Likutei Torah and his classical works in the Parsha, and he says as follows. The fact is, what day did Hashem create the world? We're celebrating Rosh Hashanah. It's not the day Hashem created the world. Hashem created the world 6 days before, on the 25th day of the month of Elul. On Rosh Hashanah is the 6th day of creation. Why the 6th day of creation? What happened unique on the 6th day of creation? That's the day that mankind was created. And if that's the case, what does it mean when we say today is the beginning of your actions, a remembrance of the first day? The world was created 6 days before. So what does the Alter Rebbe explain? That even though that when Hashem created the world, it all happened on the 25th day of the month of Elul, which is the beginning of the 6 days of creation, and like it says clearly in the Torah, Bereshis in the beginning, Bara Elokim, as a Shemayim as Aretz, in the beginning Hashem created the heaven and the earth. And how much more so that every part of creation, in other words, the whole concept of time was created then, space was created then, the existence of time and space was created then. But the fact is, even though it all happened on the 25th of Elul, but the completion of the creation only happened on the 6th day of creation. Why? Because that's the day mankind was created. And that's why, even though again creation happened on the 25th Elul, what do we call Tchilas Maasecha, the beginning of your action? The beginning, and it's a remembrance to the first day. That's specifically when? The 6th day of creation, because that's when mankind was created. And Beisender explains, he says, now we'll understand why this day, the day of Rosh Hashanah, is called Kesa, where it's covered up. And like we also learned, it's a time and it's a place, because even though that the creation of time and space and its whole existence wasn't the beginning of creation 6 days before, but nevertheless, this day, the day of Rosh Hashanah, the day mankind was created, that is the completion of the whole existence of the world, time, and space. Why? Because that's when mankind was created. Why is that? The number explains powerfully. Because mankind that was created, Adam HaRishon, he affected completion in the whole creation. Why? Because until then, the world was there, but God wasn't revealed. But when God created mankind, Adam, he drew down godliness, and like we're learning here, the terminology Malchusai, the kingdom of Hashem, in the world. And that's why the first person that was created is called Adam, because he's compared. Adam comes from the word of Adam, he's compared to on high. What does that mean? He drew down godliness into this physical world to make a dwelling place for God down here in the space of time and space. Now, just like this happened in the first time when Hashem created the world, that mankind in Rosh Hashanah affected completion of the creation of the world, and also in time, the same thing also, every single year, through the work of every single Jewish person, which we're all called Adam, because we're compared to Hashem. In other words, every one of us, by doing our spiritual work, praying, studying Torah, doing mitzvahs, we draw down godliness into this world. And then the contrary, it explains. That's why, when it came to creation, man was created alone. Why? To teach you that whoever keeps a human being alive, and you bring a human being into this world, is if you're keeping the whole world alive. In other words, mankind was created alone because he's compared to almost the one Hashem. Because the power that every individual has to make this world a dwelling place for Hashem. To explain this idea, in other words, what happens in Rosh Hashanah is we're drawing down God, the kingdom of Hashem, and it's connected with a specific time, and also with our spiritual work. So there's two things that happen in Rosh Hashanah. One is that we are doing the work, and we're doing it in the finite physical world. Why is that? He explains, we know that the ultimate intent why God decided to create the world was to create a dwelling place for Hashem down here. I'll say it in Hebrew. Tachlis kavanas habriya. The ultimate intent for creation of the world is lasois lo yisborach, to make for Hashem himself a dwelling place down in this world. In other words, what does it mean practically? That God should be revealed down here, which means where God is concealed. We should reveal God where God is concealed. And it should be in the level of literally in the place where that rejects God should start welcoming God in time and space, and to make a dwelling place for Hashem down here. And who does that? The Jewish people do that. And because of that, the drawing down Malchus and Rosh Hashanah is specifically in time, and specifically through the Jewish people. And that's why the Torah says, "Es Hashem hemarta hayoim," that Hashem you said today. So, and we know that the powerful teaching of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Maharash in this discourse in the year Tafresh Lamed, and which we know the Rebbe Maharash is known as his title Lachatchila River. To begin with, you go off the chart, and he says that when you say Hamarta, there's actually three translations. The first translation and the important translation is Hamarta comes from an expression of Shvach and Tainug, praise and pleasure. So Hamarta is referring to, again, praise and pleasure. Hayoim is referring to what? Rosh Hashanah. In other words, Hamarta Hayoim is referring to drawing in pleasure on Rosh Hashanah. And like it's explained elsewhere, that's also why Shofar of Rosh Hashanah is also the idea of pleasure. Like it says, shofar is from the expression of shapru, masechem, beautify, pleasure. So what do we see from here? That what's the main work of Rosh Hashanah? We're getting ready for what do we have to accomplish in Rosh Hashanah? We have to complete the pleasure and the enjoyment of Hashem. That Hashem wanted to make a dwelling place for himself down here in this world. Now how does that happen? It happens through the Jewish people, Marta. And he continues on to explain the Chassidic discourse that the idea of building Malchus, which we said that takes place in Rosh Hashanah, we're making God as a king. And like it's explained at length in the writings of the Arizal. How does that happen? It happens through when we do the work of Tamlichuni Aleichem. We're saying, God, we want you to be a king over us. Now, in order for that to happen, for God to be the king over us, we have to take away anything of concealment, anything that's not allowing that flow to come in. And he'd like to explain the flow of these ideas based on what we learned before. In other words, since what happens in Rosh Hashanah, what in Rosh Hashanah, the Malchus, kingdom, gets concealed and gets elevated. So what does that mean? We have to make God God over us, Tamlichuni Aleichem. So in order to create that reality that God should be king over us, we have to nullify any concealment. Since Malchus was concealed and it went into a state of hiding, so we have to go ahead and break that concealment so that God can come once again revealed. How do you do that? So you have to basically nullify anything which is stopping and breaking that to happen. And specifically, sometimes the body gets in the way. And what means the body? If you're not wealthy, so therefore everyone should have healing, and should have a healing very, very quick, a complete healing. And up to the point when you have the healing, it should be like kiflayim l'shrim, which means it's a double healing. Because if you heal, then you're about to bring godliness into the world. And after you take away the things which are not allowing to do our work, because as we know, that's the idea of refinement of the vessel. So that's the first part. You got to clean up. You got to clean up so there's nothing blocking, bringing down godliness. But then you have to do it by ratzon, with will. And as we know that when you do it with will, with the sphere of ratzon, which is the lower sphere of keser, then it becomes very, very stronger, even stronger. Then just by cleaning the vessel. So once you have to clean the vessel, then you have to have the will to do it. And like to explain the Chassidic discourse, that's the whole idea of accepting God as the king, literally, which has to be done in a way of berotzain. Malchusay berotzain kibul aleim. We accept it with our will. And when you accept it with your will, obviously it's much more powerful. And so when we do the work of nullifying anything which is stopping the flow from coming down, and then that's Surmirah, taking away the evil, which makes sure there's nothing in the way, and then doing the work of Beratzin with will. So then you build Malchus. So the Rebbe is saying there's two ingredients to building Malchus. One is you have to stop anything that's getting in the way of allowing the flow to come down, and then you have to want it. And up till we have the ultimate completion, where we're going to have the union of Yud Kei Vav Kei, the infinite part of Hashem, and Elokim, the final part of Hashem, the union of the light and the flow, and up to the point that even the concealment of Elokim, which is the idea of Malchus, that itself will give off the light. And that's why Malchus is built in almost like an image. In other words, what's the image of Malchus versus like a dot of it? Because it's basically bringing in powerful light, like it's explained in that discourse at length. And he continues on with it to explain, that's also an explanation in the blessings of shofars. When we make the blessing on shofar, what do we say? Shoimeya, hear. Koil, truas amo Yisrael barachim. He hears the voice of the blast of the Jewish people with compassion. So what does it mean, trua? Trua means to basically break anything that's coarse, anything's physical, any of the arrogance. So trua is, the trua, the sound that you're hearing is to chop up and to break anything that's physical and coarse that's not allowing the flow to come in. And then you're able to accomplish that the Malchus should be in a way that's revealing the light. And therefore, what happens is, since the avoida is to break with anything that's in the way, that's one of the reasons why when Yontiv Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, and like when the Rebbe said the Chassidic discourse that year, Yontiv Rosh Hashanah was on Shabbat, not this year, but that year it was. So then when the Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. Why? Because Rebbe explains something beautiful. Because on Shabbos, you don't have to break anything. Because we know Shabbos, you're not allowed to go ahead and differentiate between the good and bad, etc. Why is that? Because Shabbos is the ultimate completion. And that's the truth of materialism. And therefore you don't have to go and break anything, you don't have to weed anything out. However, so that's why we don't blow the shofar on Shabbos, no reason to break anything. However, he continues on the fact that that's the case, why do we blow the shofar in the temple? And he explains because the fact is in the Beit HaMikdash, the materialism is just the way it is. And it's obviously on the highest refinement of level. And the materialism is perfect, there's no issues over there. But nevertheless, we blow the shofar in the Mikdash on Shabbat because it's not about transforming it or weeding it out, but it's actually taking it to a whole different level of refinement. And never says possibly you can add, based on what it's known, that in the Holy of Holies, so we know that the Holy of Holies, the place where the ark stood, it didn't take up space. In other words, they had no limitations, because the fact is you can measure 10 amot from each side, and the fact is the ark technically took up place, which we know, it says in the Torah, it was 2.5 in the length, 2.5 in the width, and 1.5 in the height, but nevertheless it didn't take up place. Why? Because the materialism was on the highest level, that the even finite was infinite. So just like the ark didn't take up space, so technically you measured, it should take up space, but it didn't because it was the highest level, and that's the same reason why in the Mikdash it wasn't an issue of blowing the shofar on Shabbat. And you can say that on an internal level, that flow of energy, which was accomplished in the Beit HaMikdash by blowing the shofar on Shabbat, that obviously draw down in every single space and every single time. And like that, we know that when you don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which is Shabbat, but nevertheless, even though you don't blow the shofar, but nevertheless we say the verses of Malchios, Chronot, and Shofarot, and which is basically the ideas that would draw down the Beis Mikdash, because the fact is by saying the verses in every single space, every single area, every single time, we actually draw that we draw down the idea of Malchus, and like it's understood from the verses that we say in every place and every time. So how many verses are there? So there's 10 verses. Why 10 verses? That corresponds to the 10 spheres. That's how you build Malchus. And which basically, by saying the verses, you're actually building the building. So you could say not only that, even more than that in every single time, every single place, how does it come down? It comes down through the blowing of the shofar that took place in the Beit HaMikdash. And ever since, you can say the explanations as follows. That we know what Chazal teach us based on the verse. So the Torah says, "V'shachanti b'soicham." Make me a temple. I'm going to dwell amongst them, plural. So the question is, when b'soichai in the temple? Why does it say b'soicham plural? Because the fact that Hashem dwells in every single person. What does that mean? In every single Jewish person has within them b'soicham. Every single person has part of the Mikdash, and that's why they blew the shofar in the temple in Shabbat. And not only that, this verse of V'shachanti b'soicham, Hashem is saying He dwells within every single Jewish person. It's referring to the which Mishkan, the tabernacle that Moshe Rabbeinu did. And we know what Moshe Rabbeinu built is everlasting, as everything Moshe Rabbeinu did was everlasting. And especially like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that every single person has a part of Moshe Rabbeinu amongst them, which is infused within every one of us. And it totally consumes us. And especially, every one of us has the concept of the ark within us, because we know the ark doesn't have any limits. So where's the ark? Every single person's internal heart has the Beis HaMikdash within us. And like the Alter explains in Likutei Torah, and as well in the Chassidic discourse of the Winkler Rebbe. So what does that mean practically? Since we all have within us a piece of Moshe Rabbeinu, and we all have within us a piece of the ark, so therefore every single one of us has the power to accomplish on Yontiv of Rosh Hashanah, which is on Shabbat, to elevate the materialistic world even higher than the ultimate completion that was in the temple by blowing the way they blew then the shofar on Shabbat. And especially the way it's brought down in the Chassidic discourses that brings from the Zohar, that on Shabbat, that point gets spread out. In other words, you have full completion of building Malchus in a way that it's totally revealed, that we can actually see it and experience it. And especially like it's explained in that famous Chassidic discourse, that every single Shabbat, you can connect to some feeling of just like what's going to be like in the future when Mashiach comes. So what do you see from here? That when we do our work by blowing the shofar, when Bakesa, when it's concealed on Rosh Hashanah, we actually affect building Malchus on the highest level and up to the point where it actually creates in this physical world. And let's explain in the Chassidic discourse that the true work that is the ultimate goal is that even the materialistic physical world should be a vessel for the infinite light of Hashem. And that's why it says Allah Elokim Betrua. What does that mean, Allah Elokim Betrua? We know Elokim is the shame of judgment. It's finite. But even Elokim gets elevated. And there's the finite and limited part of the world that was created from the name Elokim, like it says, Bereish Bara Elokim, the beginning of Hashem created from finite. But how does it get elevated? It gets elevated. Everything in this world that was created from Elokim gets elevated to the level of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And even the Yud Kei Vav Kei gets elevated through the shofar, which that's the whole idea of Yichud, the union of Yud Kei Vav Kei and Elokim, which we're creating a new concept in the world, in the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, where it gets elevated, as well as name Elokim, which gets elevated into the level of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And the Rebbe finishes it so powerfully, he says this as follows: it should be the will of Hashem, and for every one of us, that all these ideas should come down to this world. And what does it mean practically? That literally, on a materialistic level, we should all have a ksiva v'chasima toiva. We should all be written and sealed for a good year. La'alter, right away, l'chayim toivim, we should all have right away a good life. And we should be written into the book of all the righteous people. And like we know, when Mashiach comes, even tzaddikim are going to do tshuva. And we're going to have the redemption, the true redemption, the complete redemption, through Mashiach Tzidkenu. And like it's explained at length in the Chassidic discourse, that the Trua is connected to Yaakov and Yaakov of the third of the patriarchs and King David, and we know David is the king Messiah, and with the true Mashiach, the righteous Mashiach, and he should come b'mheira b'yameinu mamash very, very soon and very, very quickly. So here we have another beautiful, powerful Chassidic discourse in honor of Rosh Hashanah. A lot of ideas. We can take away many, many different points. I think one of the main points is that we have the power, every one of us, to do things from a new level. Every single day we can live like as if it's a brand new life. And by doing that, we'll bring down the greatest blessings of godliness into the world. We'll make a dwelling place for Hashem down here. And with the ultimate coming of Mashiach, which will all go to Yerushalayim Ar Kodesh. And next class will be in Yerushalayim Ar Kodesh. Have a great and blessed week. Shavua Tov and Shana Tova U'Mesuka.